Okay, I welcome everybody to the second panel of the day. This is a more crowded one, so we have 4 speakers across 2 hours. And we will start with a slightly altered order. Eyad is going to present first, then I will present my, let's say not paper, but work in progress. And then who's next? Fatimi? Or Sohaib? So I'll figure out the order then. I would like to welcome Eyad back to Berlin. He was here for 2 years, I think, or 2.5 years?
2.5.
2.5 years. Working at our research unit on emotions in Sufism or Sufi movements. Now he is at Cardiff University in a project that looks into education across history, something like that.
Yeah, knowledge transition.
Knowledge transition,
yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But mostly looking into madaris and stuff.
Yeah,
no,
sure,
I misunderstood,
sure.
obviously. Okay, so
it's part of it, yeah. It's part.
Before I like embarrass myself further, the floor is yours. We're all happy to hear you talk. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be back. And yeah, so this is based on some previous, it's taking some of my previous work in a different direction, so apologies if some people have seen similar material before. I'm trying to sort of reframe things and look at the transmission of knowledge in Sufism, in Sufi contexts, in the sort of period of institutionalization between the 12th and 13th centuries. But largely looking at conceptions of space, but also I'll be focusing a lot on visual material, visuality, and the material culture of medieval Sufi institutions as well. So generally we tend to think of Sufi knowledge production as a process of developing, systematizing, formalizing sort of abstract psychological or cosmological, ontological concepts. And in this sense, theoretical treatises are usually sort of privileged. So like the big works of theory, like Ibn Arabi, Ghazali, etc. And often you see like other thinkers are given a bit less attention because their texts tend to not fit this sort of mold of heavily theoretical work. So people like Ruzbehan Bakli or Shamsuddin Dailami or many Kubrawi authors. I think if we're talking about the transmission of ideas, it's not and knowledge and the production of knowledge, it's not just the abstract like ideas that are being transferred from one person to another, but it's a whole sort of embodied experience, which and a set of practices, a set of rules, a set of a way of configuring the body and the senses that really also allows the transmission, not just the transmission of knowledge, but what I hope to show is that it also, these sensory experiences also offer authors the chance to reconfigure and reconfigure and develop and produce new knowledge within the Sufi framework. And largely I'll be focusing on visions as a moment in which these reconfigurations are effected, because just some of the figures I'll be looking at today. So all sort of 12th, 13th century, Najmuddin Kubra, Saifuddin Bakhazi, who is Najmuddin Kubra's student, Dailami, if I have time, and Ruzbehan Bakli. But all what sort of is common to all these authors is a focus on visions, as well as the production of autobiographical dream journals or visionary journals. In order to sort of conceptualize this so I mean, something is clearly happening in this period where visions are becoming far more important in Sufi discourses and are being recorded more often, being transmitted, being circulated within Sufi communities. Often I think it's this sort of what these texts tend to be doing is establishing a sort of framework or a sort of what religious studies scholars sometimes call a sensory regime, where ideas of display and figuration are formalized and reflect institutional structures. But here I also want to show that they reflect conceptions of space, not just institutionally, and the sort of hierarchies that exist within the Sufi community, but also how the centrality of cosmology is related to the production of visions and how visions are understood and recorded and transmitted. So to discuss this, I sometimes use the work of Bender and Marinan, who have this book on the culture of diagram. And sort of Bender and Marinan sort of argue that diagrams concretize processes of knowledge and knowledge production and generate understandings relationally in the visual meeting of user and image. And the knowledge produced through this visual practice is related to the experience and the orientation or the expertise of the user. And I like to think that dreams and visions are also moments in which this relational meeting between the Sufi and a vision that is not sort of, might not be sort of consciously created, but still informed by the repertoire of Sufi practices, provides a moment of production of new types of knowledge. So just a quick, a brief thing I have to cover is the relations between visuality and cosmology and the notions of space. So generally, you see a common trope in Sufi cosmological theories. So this is sort of taken from Ikhwan al-Safa, but represented by Ahmed Karim Mustafa in his article Cosmographical Diagrams. And you see this like sort of common circular concentric circles depiction of what the cosmos looks like. So you have Earth at the center and the different spheres surround it. This is a common way in which the Earth was sort of, I mean, the world, the cosmos was envisioned. Interestingly, even some of the earliest Sufi diagrams also bear a similar form, essentially. So this is taken from Al-Hallaj, as I think this is the Tawasin. And so he has these diagrams of spiritual experience. I think in Hallaj's case, they're sort of meant to be objects of contemplation as well. But he also maps sort of degrees of knowledge or degrees of mystical experience onto these circular diagrams. You get many of these sort of circular diagrams, so Ghazali has some as well, and in that he sort of references the cosmological significance of the soul by referring to each part of the soul as a alam, so the alam al-nafs, alam al-qalb, and alam al-ruh, in this sort of diagrammatical form. And that's really because the soul was understood as a microcosmic reflection of the cosmos. So everything that was contained in the cosmos is sort of contained in the soul. So it makes sense to represent the soul as in the same way that someone would represent the cosmos, right? But I mean, what I'd like to do is sort of tie that to the emergence of Sufi institutions as well. So, I mean, we have to sort of conceive of space also as a practice. So the practice of space, like how does space come into being? And that's usually through Sufi institutional relations, as well as Sufi practices of dhikr, sama. These all determine the construction of a space, and I sort of referred to discussions of space in European medieval studies. So this is from a book called Practice of Space, the practice of space in medieval in the medieval period, I think. And so space is a mutable field of specifiable relations and structures. It's actuated by an ensemble of movements deployed within it as a structure that is determined by the distribution of economic, social, cultural, and theological capital. And so, I mean, obviously you get the institutionalization of Sufism through patronage and economic underpinnings that allow the production of specific Sufi spaces. And I think in this sense, cosmology becomes even more important, because the reflection of not just the human body and soul is understood microcosmologically, but the Sufi institution itself is sort of understood in this sort of cosmological framework. And so before I turn to like examining some of these visions and how they might relate to the conceptions of space and articulations of space, I would like to just do a brief overview of Sufi cosmology in the Kubrawi framework. So, I mean, this is taken from, this is Jamal Ilyas's representation of Simnani's cosmology, but it basically follows the system of the sort of cosmology of the early Kubrawis, more or less. So you have God rules the earth through the divine footstool, the kursi, sometimes it's the arsh, and then you have the sphere of the stars, and then the planets, and then the elements, and the elements combine on earth to make, in order of complexity, inanimate objects, so matter, ma'adin, plants, animals, and then humans. So in the Kubrawi context, humans are understood to be the final beings in the process of creation, and for that reason they contain within them all the sort of realities of every station up to that. So the human being has an internal Saturn, an internal Mars, an internal Jupiter, and has all the elements, and is both matter, plant, and animal. So generally that's the sort of idea. And in Kubrawi context as well, the human being reflects this in a psychological way as well. So the footstool, or the kursi, or the arsh, is analogous to the human heart, and the heart rules the body, depending on whichever faculty of the soul rules the heart. So if the ego rules the heart, then the body behaves in an egoistic manner. If the spirit, the ruh, rules the heart, then a more praiseworthy conduct emerges from the body. So the relationship between God and the world is understood as analogous to the relationship between the human soul and the human body. So you have this descent of the human being through the cosmos, and the ascent of the human being occurs through the microcosmos. You have to ascend internally to reach perfection, spiritual perfection. So in the Kubrawi tradition, and it's worth noting that the way in which visions were induced was through dhikr, a long period of dhikr in khalwa, in a room of sensory deprivation, which was built within the institution, in the Sufi lodge, Khanaqah itself. So what you have is, but access to that room very much required an initiation ritual where the disciple would learn the phrase of dhikr, which was La ilaha illallah, from the master, as well as specific breathing patterns, and then could enter the room And then, in that sense, this access to this room would allow visions and would be the place where practice would induce visions. And in that sense, the cosmos became inhabitable, visible. The microcosmos was experienced in this room of, in this Bayt al-Khalwa. And I'm not saying that that's true for all other Sufis in this case, but it seems that the practice of dhikr was always closely linked to the experience of visions. So you have this vast expansive space being experienced only through this sort of institutional space as well, the access to this institutional space as well. And you can see this cosmological reflection in Najmuddin Kubra's work. So he says, so Najmuddin Kubra in his Fawa'ih al-Jamal wa Fawatih al-Jalal says that he's speaking to the reader as he speaks to the reader as my beloved, that you are not free of the four pillars of existence, earth, water, fire, and air in their entirety until the final death. But with this lesser death, some of it is erased from you, and you will see with your eye what you come to know what you came to know with your mind. And he goes on to give examples of this. So this really incorporates dreams into this cosmological scheme. So he says, if you see yourself crossing oceans and you're surrounded by them, this is you like crossing or erasing the particularities of water from you. And if you see rain falling on the earth, then this is you sort of crossing the boundary of the earth, material of earth within you. And then he goes on and says, if you enter fire and leave from fire, then you also cross the sphere of fire. And if you see a vast expanse and emptiness, this is and skies, this is air. And then he mentions seeing colors on the horizon, and these colors difficult to understand or explain fully, but they're sort of associated with spiritual conditions, and they're often associated with the planets. So each planet tends to have a certain color connected to it, and they're also they're referred to ahwal, spiritual ahwal, basically. It's also mapped affectively. So you have this affective mapping of space and the spheres. Sorry. Sorry. I think I forgot a slide, but. Okay, sorry, I've messed up so another Sufi Ruzbehan Baqli also, so these visions are supposed to be sort of initiatic visions almost. They're sort of the beginning sort of visions where rather than but the interesting thing is Ruzbehan al-Baqli, who was not really a Kubrawi, also reports similar visions, and he says, for example, one of his visions, he says that while I was in the desert of the unseen, he saw 7 heavens and a great ocean suspended in the sky, and in this ocean was an island, and in the island was a fortress. And he asks God, what is this? And he says, this is the island of Al-Quds, divinity. I translated it as divinity here, but can translate in different ways. And then within the island of divinity and the fortress of divinity. Now, what struck me when I was reading this is how the sort of circularity of the thing kind of is sort of like you can envisage like an ocean and then an island, and then inside the island a fortress. So you can see that the circularity is being reproduced in a vision, and it's also and it's also like, I think it's both constituting the diagrammatic material culture of the Sufi community, but that is also influencing like sort of being represented in the visions that Sufis are reporting. And then, of course, you get these discussions of divinity, like what is this, what is that, And really you're getting a nuancing of the spiritual experience and the production of sort of new knowledge. I have other examples that show this a bit more explicitly. So I don't think I have time to read everything word for word. But Saifuddin al-Bakhrzi, one of Kubra's disciples, sort of says, so he has this dream journal called Waqa'i al-Khalwa, and in it he recounts his dreams, and they're followed by Najmuddin Kubra's interpretations of these dreams. And so what's interesting here is that the ritual of dhikr is connected, is referred to in the dream journal, and the entering of the Bayt al-Khalwa is also referred to in the dream journal, in the visionary journal rather. And what this does sometimes is sort of blur the boundaries between physical space and imagined space as well. So in the first vision, this is a good example of how the spaces are blurred. So he says, on Thursday in time of Sahar before dawn, and just at the moment of sunrise, he was consumed by recollection. He was doing dhikr, and he was facing the Qibla, and then he saw a sky full of stars and shining planets. After a door was opened in the Bayt al-Khalwa, a door was opened in the Bayt al-Khalwa. He saw the sky full of stars and planets, and he said he had a moment of chest expansion, like bust, and then he remained looking and was sort of entranced by it. Then he performs dhikr more intensely, and he goes out to pray. And when he's coming back, he sees the sun is rising, and it's not clear if this is the physical sun that he's seeing or if it's a vision. But I think it just seems like it's the physical sun from the text. Najmuddin Kubra interprets this for him, saying that that this is the hidden world, the Ghaib, was open to him, and what happened was actually, it is clear that it's the physical sun, because Kubra says the transference of the vision from the hidden world to the manifest world indicates the nobility of his spirit. And he explains this by saying that God created souls before he created bodies, so the vision occurs to the soul and then it occurs to the body. So you get this sacralization or of a very common, like, sunrise. Everyone experiences sunrise, and a blurring of the boundary between the ghaib and the shahada, and the room of seclusion and the outer world. Another one of his so the second vision in Bakhrzi's text is he sees a person appear to him with the head of a bird and the body of a man, and a voice says to him that this is the nafs, the lower soul, and he says to himself, I should seize this opportunity and cut its neck. So he reaches out and grasps a knife, and he cuts its neck off. At that point, there appears to him a wooden surface which spins around very quickly, and it's like a water wheel, and each wheel contains a head like the bird that he just cut off. And it says to him, I'm the lower soul, these heads are mine. If you cut one off, another one will come back. And he says that he felt very confused by this vision and was very upset by this vision. It's understandable, it's quite disturbing. Kubra says that the bird is this nafs appeared to him in an animal form because it's the animal soul in this cosmological scheme. Animal is still quite something very initiatic that someone needs to get over. And then the knife was dhikr, and the spinning was the representation of the auditory dhikr in a visual form. And the reason it appeared as a wooden surface is because the Quran describes the unbelievers as inanimate wood or material. And the reason it spins is because it's a veil to the sun which lies behind it. And again, you get this cosmological significance for the vision being introduced. And then the last one I want to discuss very briefly is So his third vision, I think this might be his fourth vision actually, but I've listed it as the third. But anyway, so he sees in a state of dhikr and this is a state where he says his lower soul was more restrained, his nafs was more restrained, and he looked inside his chest and he saw as if his chest had been opened up and torn apart. He saw a piece of flesh in there. He describes it as delicate, and subtle, latif. And a voice said to him, "This is the heart." So he looked into it, and he saw that it had a tongue like a bird, and eyes that were like those of a cat. And then he saw, just to briefly go over it, I saw that the tongue was moving in accordance to to his dhikr. Not slower or faster, the same speed. And then he says that for a while he was able to push away his khawatir. These are like thought impressions, also mentioned in philosophical texts, and in dhikr the point is to negate khawatir. He says that, so then he says that Kubra interpreted this for him, saying that the heart has two eyes and two ears, like one physical, one for the ghaib. And then he refers to a hadith that says there's an organ in the body, which is the heart, and if it is made sound, then the eyes and the limbs of the body become sound as well. So what you can see is that this process of experiencing a vision, writing it down, getting it interpreted, functions as a mode of, as instances where knowledge is not just enacted but produced and discussed. So, through these discussions, the different faculties of the soul are given certain affective qualities. They are nuanced a bit more. They're understood in different ways. There's references to hadith, references to Quran. And each time a vision occurs, it functions as a moment in which Sufi cosmology can not only be inhabited, but also lived, experienced, but also developed. And so I think these texts on visions are give us important insight into the transmission of knowledge in Sufi contexts. I don't think I have much time left, so I'm just going to sort of conclude. I did want to discuss, but I don't think it's necessary. These lata'if, these parts of the soul, are so being detailed and described, their qualities, as I mentioned, whether with the heart or the ruh or the nafs, and because they're understood in microcosmological sense, that also generates a conception of space, the space in which the body inhabits, but also the institutional space of the Sufi institution is what makes this vision or these visions possible almost. And so you get this sort of cartographical representation of the soul that is enacted in visions, but also influencing the material culture that's being produced in texts, and also the circulation of these texts within Sufi communities and beyond Sufi communities, I think, as well, and Sufi publics. Basically, I think I've run over my time. So essentially, I just wanted to make this link between cosmological space, institutional space, and the body and the soul, and how experiences, how this offers us an insight into the, Sufi epistemology is often quite difficult to access for scholars working in academic fields, right? So I think by using these conceptions of space, visuality, and senses, body, sensory regime, we can at least get towards some understanding of how these texts and experiences function as moments of knowledge production that are worthy of study. So, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we should take Q&As right now.
Okay.
Because we have like 4 papers, and at least I can speak for myself. I tend to forget what the first had said after like 4 papers. Yeah, please, Janita.
Yes, thank you, Eyad. This was really interesting. So I was wondering whether you can comment on the form of these works. So we see the excerpts, we see the, especially the ones related to the visions. And I'm also interested in them being in the first-person narrative, which is kind of comparatively rare for the period in which they were produced. So what did it mean? Like, do we know anything about the transmission as a pre-scripted text for some other visions? So is there any kind of... Basically, those are 2 questions. So how do these visions relate to... you've mentioned that they also use the Quran and the Hadith, right? So how do they relate in terms of form? So that's one. And the second is whether... like, what's the circulation of this in general?
Yeah, no, that's really, it's really important. I think, they are, you're right, they are rare, and even in Sufi contexts, it's not always common to find first person narratives and sort of journals and diaries. I think you see, I mean, all of these texts that I've listed, all of these figures that I've discussed, all of them are producing autobiographical works, almost, in a visionary autobiography, essentially. I think why, sort of, the reasons why it's happening are multifaceted. So I think, as I said, there's a tendency to I think what was happening was a centralization of Sufis around particular sheikhs, basically, when in the past they were loosely structured communities. And so I think the personality of the sheikh is also becoming a bit more important. So Ruzbihan, for example, he has this whole, he starts from his childhood. He says, I started getting visions when I was like 6. And then at 15, I saw this, and then at this, and then it's really like from the beginning onwards, and sort of constructs a narrative of someone who was very close to God or spiritual. And so I think that's one reason. The other thing was, I think, the function of the sheikh as someone who can interpret dreams was important for the collective, the sense of belonging of the Sufi community. So through the process of dream interpretation, the sheikh could embed these experiences in a shared cosmological framework. So in this sort of cosmological scheme that was shared amongst all the members of the Sufi community. So there are lots of social reasons for that. In terms of, but also it's a period of, you have the sort of more reception of philosophy in Sufism, and I think the formalization of Sufi psychological theory and cosmology, and I think autobiography is a good way to do that. That both formalizes and systematizes things, and narrativizes them, but also sort of makes them like relatable, interesting stories for people to read, and in sort of that can be told orally and also engaged with public. So I think those are all some reasons why. And the references to Hadith and Quran, I think, are common in I think that's always been the case in Sufism, like since the early period, from Junaid. Like the early writers of Sufism, like Sulami and so forth. I think there are particular hadith and Quranic verses that tend to get more focus because they sort of, they're more sort of amenable to this sort of to what's going on in this visionary in these visionary autobiographies. Yeah. Sorry, it's not a proper answer, but like, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for this great presentation. Actually, I have one quick question and another just out of curiosity, because I'm completely unaware with this topic. So the first one, just like, is there any reason why you chose these 4 authors? I'm sorry if I missed the point, but I was just like wondering about the decision of these 4 authors you were focusing on.
They're all thinkers that lived around the same time in the same area.
Okay.
In Iran and Central Asia.
I see. Okay.
And all of them produced some sort of autobiographical visionary work. Like all of them have this pivot towards focusing on visions, and all of them talk in first person as well. That's why I'm discussing all of them.
I'm sorry if I missed that point actually.
No.
But the other question is, you also, the thing with the visions for producing knowledge and transmission knowledge was amazing, absolutely makes sense to me, but you also mentioned dreams, right in the beginning. So, and I know from other sources that they're often literary topoi they're using. So just out of curiosity, do you came across this topoi also in the works you are focusing on? Just like, and how did you deal with this aspect actually? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, also thank you from me for your presentation. I was I thought 2 days ago Fahima Ulfa talked about the distinction between implicit knowledge and explicit knowledge, and I was interested how you would where would you see the relationship between your visions and these graphics? So is the reference to these to these cosmologies, is that something that you would say they have like an implicit knowledge of, or is that on purpose that they use these imageries in their visions?
Okay. Thank you. So dreams as tropes. I think you do still see that. So the idea that a dream will predict something, or that it functions as a narrative device. But I think what's really different about these texts, and Kubrawi texts in particular, is the dreams as diagnostic tools. So they're not just narrative devices. They're saying, like, almost in a sort of psychoanalytic way, this is what's happening to your soul, and this is why you feel this way, and this is and that's what to me is very interesting about these texts, because they're very much diagnostic, and so the dream is not sort of a device within the text, but it is the subject of the text, right? It's the entire text is about dreaming and visions, and I'm using the terms interchangeably, dreams and visions, because it's difficult to know sometimes whether it's a dream or a vision, because a vision is something that's happening in the waking state during dhikr, but sometimes dreams are included as well. Really it's that's the sort of difference, I would say. And in terms of implicit or explicit knowledge, I think, if I understand correctly, do you mean what the sort of why these images appear, or like why they choose these? Is this? Is this like an effort on their part to refer to those, or is this just ready in their mind? Is this are these images of the cosmology something that is pervasive in the culture at the time, that that it's obvious that they would either use that in their retellings or actually see that in their So I think dreams are always sort of culturally dependent. So like I think they're sort of like, if you've never seen a particular animal or tree, it's unlikely that you would dream of it, right? So like I think, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. But like I think it's like, to some extent, it's like, if you're existing in this environment, and if you're a Sufi disciple, for example, and the discourse is about this, you're experiencing this on a daily basis, and you dream about common things, I would say, like sometimes they mention cities or towns or animals or things like that. I think it's just a way in which sort of images are, so that the image happens or the vision happens, which is a sort of biological, I mean, you could say it's a material biological thing, but then it has to be socialized, right? It has to acquire a social and cultural meaning. And I think in some cases, I think in some ways the images are sort of predetermined by the environment that people live in. I think that's sort of a fair thing to say, but I mean, it can be debated, of course. And I think, you know, if you're surrounded by a particular material culture, then it's likely that it will appear in your dreams as well, like in your visions, right? Like a lot of people dream about going to school and something embarrassing happening, but like that probably wouldn't happen to like a medieval person because they wouldn't have gone to school, like in the same way. Like, you know, I mean, it's difficult for me to answer really, like, because we're dealing with like imagination and things. But I mean, like, so for example, in the last slide I was going to show was this like mapping of the, Shamsuddin Dailami sort of, this is like the spiritual body. It's also cosmological, but he like maps, so you can see it's an abstracted body with like a head, chest, and stomach, and he maps certain spiritual states in this. This sort of leaves the circular metaphor, but you can see that this was something they're very much interested in, and they keep. And he says this image was, he saw this in a dream, in a vision, and he wrote it down as a guide to disciples, that they should look at it, contemplate it, and think about it. So, yeah. So, thank you very much.
Okay, yeah, join me in thanking Eyad for his interesting talk. Actually, don't know when the last time was I saw an animal in my dream. I got to think.
Just don't think about that.
Okay, so I guess I need to set up the... Okay, I've opened all the other PowerPoints and now I can't find mine. Huh. Okay, here we go. So, this talk was, I have to admit, ambition is everything, yeah? And so, if you have, I'm sure some of you can relate, talked about your earlier research for like 2 years in a row, then you at some point want to do something else. And there was an attempt to at least try to do something else, or in addition to something. So the main idea is to look into strategies of remembrance, in particular how Andalusian scholars are depicted in biographical dictionaries in Damascus, mostly Damascus during the Ayyubid and Mamluk period. Unfortunately, I didn't really get to the depictions or narratives of the Andalusian scholars. So far I wanted to give you an idea of what, like the main idea that stood behind or stands behind this project, and where I am at and what I would like to do. What is interesting about Syria, especially Damascus in the 13th century, is that through a variety or a series of migration movements, the social composition of Damascus underwent an upheaval. There is a migration wave from northern and western Syria, which was caused by the Crusades. There is another one coming from Andalusia and North Africa that was caused by also the Crusades or the Reconquista. And we have a migration from Iraq and Iran caused by the Mongols, so the Mongol invasion. They all found more or less a good place to stay in Damascus, and this is because of the Waqf system that the Ayyubids back then, like not installed, but like supported. Many schools were founded, and with those schools came rich awqaf that gave scholars and students the opportunity to study and to learn and to get money from this. They could live there, they could stay there. Some madaris had a kitchen, so they were also provided by food, etc., and housing. And this was very convenient for scholars who had to leave their home and then find another in Damascus. The political patronage in Syria supported this, and during the reign of the Ayyubid sultans, there is also a shift that we can see from a more, sources say, or studies say, a more plural or plural approach in terms of religious politics, done by Al-Malik Kamil, who supported all kinds of religious movements, especially rationalist-oriented scholars. But with the reign of Al-Ashraf Musa, there is a tendency to support traditionalist views, and those traditionalist views express themselves in a tendency of anti-rational policies. There is a ban of study and teaching philosophy and logic in the Damascene schools. There's an immigration movement from rationalist scholars who left Damascus because of those tendencies and moved to Cairo, where they could do their rationalist scholarship, continue their rationalist scholarship. Well, this is still an open question whether those migrated scholars and who often had a traditionalist outview, or at least adjusted to the traditionalist climate, whether they were in contrast with the scholarly elite, the local scholarly elite, which would be mostly Shafi'i scholars who had a strong Ash'ari orientation, and some Hanbalis as well there. The bigger intellectual climate or changes also, which can we observe in this time, is that there is a stronger emphasis on the veneration of the Prophet. Not only can we see an increase in like Mawlid celebrations, but also like relics of the Prophet were installed in specific schools. They were like the sandal of the Prophet, or the Prophet's hair, or the footprints of the Prophet were stored in schools and other teaching or religious institutions in Damascus, and they were also often placed strategically, like architecturally, in a strategic place. So we have, for example, the two sandals of the Prophet placed in two madrasas, in two schools that so were on the opposite side of the road you would take to enter the citadel, for example. So you pass through, or you pass the sandals of the Prophet while entering the citadel, visiting, I don't know, the Ayyubid princes. And those probably can be seen as an attempt by the Zengids and Ayyubids to counter attack the Fatimid tendencies in Damascus by that time. So they supported the veneration of the Prophet, the relics of the Prophet, and with that, a popularization of hadith readings can be seen. There's an installment of Dur al-Hadith, which were, I think, in that period, the first time that someone would actually build or found a Dar al-Hadith. Nowadays, it's like common sense that there is Dur al-Hadith, but actually we don't really know what, if, for example, in the Ottoman period, what kind of knowledge there was ready to mobilize the local popularity against the Crusades, but also the Fatimids. Another trend is that we have to keep in mind is that Muslims in this city at that time were at least on the brink to become a majority in the city. This is not something we should take for granted. In many cities, even cities like Baghdad or others, Muslims tend to stay or be a minority till the 12th or 13th century. But now we have the fact that many scholars come to Damascus. There is a very dense network of schools in the center of the city. If you see a map of that, like every other building is a school. There's money to support scholarship, and they don't really have, if they don't want to, they don't have to engage with non-Muslims, so they can further a specialization discourse which is entirely like inner Muslim, inner Islamic. In this climate, we can see an emergence of a Damascene traditionalism, and this traditionalism expresses itself, I've already said that, in a tendency to at least criticize or to criticize rationalism. It's an attempt to exclude the Greek philosophy out of the Islamic tradition or the Islamic thinking or reasoning. And that was driven, at least I thought so, mostly by Shafi'i and Hanbali scholars who migrated from Iraq. And they might have been, the sources don't give that really away, or at least not a clear picture. I believe that those migrated.
Engaged in the previous years. So for context, my current book project is on how Indian Hanafis from the 16th century to the 20th century navigated the legal pluralism of the Indian Ocean, and especially the legal pluralism of the Ottoman Hijaz. And I look at their discourses on taqlid, legal conformity to a madhab, as well as their relationship, their engagement with hadith literature, commentary writing, and so forth, especially when it came to defending taqlid to the madhab or advocating for wider juristic possibilities outside of the Hanafi madhab. So as part of that project, I look at how Indian Hanafis engaged with Hanafis in Cairo, in Mecca, and so forth. But I also look at the other way around, look at how Indian writings penetrated or circulated deeper into Ottoman lands and domains, as far as Istanbul and so forth. So it is this latter part of the exchange, the Indian reception history in Ottoman territories, that I am touching on today. Let's see. Now, of course, when it comes to measuring transmission of scholarship, there are multiple ways and options, as we've seen from this panel itself. There's the usual focus on scholarly networks, the movement of scholars, the social, political, economic conditions, and so forth across territories. And then there's also the textual layer, the reception history of ideas, discourses, commentary writing, and so forth that goes upon measuring the circulation of knowledge and ideas. But there's also a third layer one can add in, which is not often pursued, I would say, due to the lack of solid, wider, high-quality metadata on manuscript collections today, which is to look at the circulation of manuscripts, the production of manuscripts in these regions, to see what kind of books or texts were being copied or what was more popular, and so forth. So in this talk, I'll just touch upon this briefly, based upon the new union catalog that was launched just a few months ago by the Turkish Institute for Manuscripts. And so this union catalog, which is a major game changer, contains records of about 341,000 manuscript records, which is a substantial amount from about 24 manuscript libraries in Turkey. So it's obviously not a complete account of manuscript production and circulation, but it's a good place to begin when it comes to seeing what survived, seeing what kind of titles and ideas and texts survived and made it through in Turkish collections. The initial research I did for this was actually published recently at the Islamic Law blog, where I shared some of the numbers, initial numbers, and data that came from this, examining this union catalog. I'm not going to be going over it today. I'll just be expanding upon it in various ways, but I'll just share this chart just to give you a sense. So there are multiple ways to research and examine how many Indian authored texts exist in Turkish manuscript collections. So one way to do that is to search by nisba, so searching by Hindi or Dehlawi and so forth. And these are some of the numbers that came up. And you can see immediately that it's a very Arabic-centric collection of manuscripts, which isn't the usual, which hasn't received the proper attention in as far as when it comes to Arabic historiography for South Asia. And then I decided to play around with these manuscripts, the data, and to try to organize them into categories. So these categories aren't necessarily like very hard and fast. It's just like a very loose rubric that I've decided to put together to try to understand which kind of texts are more popular than others from Indian scholars. So the first rubric or category, you could say, are some of the pedagogical texts used in teaching. And so the two figures I have here are just a sample, a very basic sample. You could add many more texts to this list, but I'll just speak about them briefly. So there is Radiuddin al-Saghani, who was born in Lahore and eventually makes his way to Hajj and then to different cities in the Middle East. And he writes several books, but his most popular book is the Mashariq al-Anwar, which is a hadith compilation, What's unique about this hadith compilation is that it's ordered by grammatical rubrics, so on the basis of the grammatical features of the hadith traditions in the compilation. So it's meant to be used as an aid for people learning both Arabic grammar and hadith at the same time. And there are references that it was used in Ottoman curriculums later on. So it's quite a high number of manuscript records, I would say, relatively speaking, compared to some of the other texts we see. And then the second author we have, Shihabuddin Dawlatabadi. He writes a text, a commentary actually, on the Kafiya of Ibn Hajib. It's called Sharh in Hindi for short. And it's interesting in that he never actually visits the Hijaz or travels outside of South Asia, but his text makes it to these domains and is from the high number of manuscript records appears to have been taught and used in at least for some period of time. It's later superseded by Mullah Jami's famous Sharh on the Kafiya and so forth. So these are two examples. You can add more. Abdul Hakim Sialkoti, for instance, also very popular in Ottoman lands. And then there's the hadith commentaries of Mullah Ali al-Qadi, of Abdul Haq Dehlawi on Mishkat al-Masabih. But these are some of the high numbers we can see as far as this rubric is concerned. The next rubric I had was of legal compilations. So these aren't commentaries as such, but their own independent legal compositions. So there's a famous Fatawa Tat al-Khaniya produced by Ibn al-Ala al-Hindi. And this particular legal compilation is produced in association with the court. So he writes it for a notable at the court, and it's patronized, which can perhaps also help explain its wide proliferation and reception in Turkish collections. And then a few centuries later, it's superseded to some extent by the Fatawa Hindiya produced in the reign of Aurangzeb Alamgir. And what's notable about the number of manuscript copies of the Fatawa Hindiya is that there's much less chance for the text to circulate because it's produced in the 1670s, 1680s, and until the rise of printing. The first printed copies are around 1810 or 20, if I remember correctly. So there is not much, it's only about 150 or so years for it to circulate, but copies of this Fatawa Hindiya actually make it contemporaneously to Ottoman lands, to the Shaykh al-Islam there via the Hajj pilgrimage route. And later on, when it comes to the age of print, the first one, Fatawa Tat al-Khaniya by Ibn al-Ala, virtually disappears from the Turkish collections. There's maybe like one copy of this text. But the Fatawa Hindiya almost doubles. There's around 120, 130 copies, print copies, records of this that appear in the Turkish Union catalog. So just seeing how some books fall out of usage and others come across over the centuries. And the third name I have here, Rahmatullah Sindhi. He writes several compilations on the monastic, on the rituals of pilgrimage to the Haramain. And so he's a Sindhi scholar who goes from Sindh to Gujarat to eventually to the Hijaz, to Mecca and Medina. And he writes at least like 3 books on the monastic. One is a very concise summary meant to be more of a travel book, you could say. The other is slightly more higher in level of legal details. And the third is like a reference work, including hundreds of aqwal from different Hanafi fuqaha. But it's interesting to see that the number is quite lower than you might expect, since he was in the Hijaz working there, and he had access to scholarship over there. One reason might be the fact that he wasn't actually patronized by any court. He was an independent scholar working on his own. But another reason is also that his own work was subject to a commentary by Mullah Ali al-Qari, and that commentary became more popular than the original text itself. And so that might explain the fact that the original text was kind of left behind and people went more so with the commentary. And then there's another category of texts on or of Sufi tariqas. So you see here some of the prominent Sufis, Ahmed Sirhindi, known as Imam Rabbani from the 17th century. And then there's Tajuddin Zakaria, also from the Naqshbandi Silsila, who goes towards Mecca. And you can see the lower numbers, 35 and 21, were quite surprising to me. I would think, given the huge emphasis in scholarly literature on Sufi networks and the fact that they're usually the prime suspects of these trans-regional encounters, intellectual encounters across Muslim lands, you'd think that there are more copies in circulation of their texts. So the maktubat are only about 35 or so. And this might go to maybe caution us to think back about the scope of Sufi network, Sufi texts, as opposed to more widespread pedagogical texts on grammar and law and so forth, as far as reconstructing the textual terrains of the early modern period. However, there are some indications of wider readability for Sufi texts. So for instance, if you look at the third person on this chart, Abdul Haq al-Dehlawi, a 17th century scholar who's widely prolific in many different topics and fields, writes hadith commentaries and all sorts of other texts. And he actually travels to the Hijaz at some point as well. The main texts in circulation, the 7 texts in circulation in the Turkish collections aren't his famous Arabic commentary on the Mishkat, which you might expect to find, but it's actually some of his more Sufi texts that he wrote. So there is this contradictory, stream of intellectual currents that dictate how these scholars and their work circulate successfully in these Turkish collections. And then the last category I have are the Rasail literature. And so the Rasail literature are often seen as, described sometimes as manuscript pamphlets, as more portable, mobile ways of communication related to the emergence of public sphere and so forth, is breaking away potentially from the more classical, canonical tradition of commentary writing and glosses and so forth. But in terms of just sheer volume, they don't seem to be as high in number as well. So some of these figures here, Imam al-Muttaqi al-Hindi, for instance, he's a Gujarati scholar who moves back and forth between Gujarat and the Hijaz and so forth. But the number 77 actually doesn't represent just the Rasail, represents mainly the Kanz al-Ummal that he wrote, which is a multi-volume, huge hadith compilation and some other texts. But he also wrote many other Rasail, but they aren't copied as much or available in multiple copies in this Turkish Union catalog. And then Ali al-Qari, who was in a stratosphere of his own with a huge number of works in the Turkish collections, most popularly his commentary on the Mishkat al-Masabih, the Hadith compilation, and several other texts as well. His Rasail also aren't found in a huge number in terms of duplicate copies in these Turkish collections. And then you also see the disparity between scholars who are based in the Hijaz versus in India itself. So going to the 18th century, someone like Muhammad Hayat al-Sindhi al-Madani, who moves from Sindh and is based in Medina, teaching at the Masjid Nabawi, he is writing texts, Rasail mainly. He doesn't really write long, multi-volume compilations. And his texts do find some circulation in the Turkish collections, even though he is writing, for instance, against Hanafi taqlid and trying to move the legal methodology beyond just taqlid and so forth. In contrast, his contemporary Shah Waliullah Dehlawi, who does travel to the Hijaz at some point and then returns to Delhi, and who's seen as one of the main intellectual figures, most prominent of the 18th century in South Asia. His rasail don't really circulate well past South Asia at this period of time. So there are some disparities between how these texts are circulating. So just to wrap up then, a few tentative conclusions. One is the importance of the Indian Ocean or the Arabian Sea route for the circulation of these texts. Now, just 2 points about this. One is that sometimes it's assumed that this route came about due to the emergence of the Safavid Empire, which acted as a buffer between Mughal, Ottoman, scholarly exchange, and so forth. But you see that it predates the Safavids. It's from the 12th century, 13th century. You see Indian scholars going. So it might be more useful to think about the pull of pilgrimage and the intellectual culture in the Hijaz itself as a gateway between lands in the Indian Ocean, in South Asia, and in the Middle East. And in that sense, the importance of legal pluralism in the Hijaz becomes all the more important as a way of negotiating relationships between madhabs and within a madhab itself. And the other point to know about this is also that this wasn't dependent on Indian scholars themselves going to the Hijaz and being present there. Their texts could travel without them traveling outside South Asia through the pilgrimage route as well. And then the second point is about the proliferation of more pedagogical texts and commentaries versus more independent and brief rasail. From volume of the manuscripts that have survived, it does appear that the textual landscape was more dominated by these classical canonical, or texts that became canonical over these centuries. And then there's the historical legacy of this intellectual transmission and exchange. Many times when it comes to tracing intellectual exchange and transmission, it's often about seeing how ideas from the Middle East or Iran or Central Asia came into India itself, and not as much on the reverse direction or flow of knowledge and information. So this shows the presence of Indian scholarship in these manuscript collections shows how Indian scholars themselves were able to access and be read in other parts of the Middle East or Ottoman lands and so forth. And the second point about this is that the memories of this are starting to be or have been invoked within South Asian educational context as well. So there's a speech by Abul Hasan Ali Nadwi, the famous 20th century Indian head of the Nadwatul Ulama, the seminary in Lucknow. And so he has a compilation of speeches he would give to students for graduation ceremonies and for the start of the year to encourage them to become better students and to give them motivation. And so he, for instance, invoked the example of Shihabuddin Dawlatabadi from the 15th century, talking about how this Indian scholar was able to reach an international audience and have his text taught for centuries in other lands. And so as a way to encourage students to think that they're also equally able to achieve those high qualities of intellectual rigor and proliferation. And yeah, that marks my talk, and I'm happy to take any questions and thoughts you have.
Yeah, thank you very much. Questions, remarks?
Thank you very much, Sohaib. This was wonderful. I was wondering about the whole project. So how do you plan to proceed with information you've gathered? And also, I mean, are you going to look into the local libraries, for example, in India? Or to look more closely into what you've gathered here from the Suleimani catalog? So are you going to look like how these manuscripts ended up like in these exact place, in this exact place? And the second question is about the language. If you could maybe comment on like the percentage. So how much of this is in Arabic, and is there anything in Ottoman translation?
Thank you. So yeah, the future of this project, well, in terms of this exercise, it's still very much in the air, I would say. I intended to use this more as background, intellectual context to then understanding how specifically works of law and hadith circulated and spread. So to spread a broader intellectual canvas and to be able to situate that specific intellectual currents. I would love to be able to complete the story and trace Ottoman texts in South Asian library collections. That would be really interesting and amazing to do, but we don't have a union catalog of all South Asian libraries or major South Asian libraries, and we can't. It's very it'd be a very tedious and time-consuming task to actually compile all the data for each library. And as far as language, yeah, the vast majority was in Arabic. So you could, I forget the actual percentage, but you could see here, for instance, there's 1,700 out of 2,000 are in Arabic alone, just for these nisbas. Obviously, there are other Indian scholars who are not included in these nisbas, and so we'd have to add them as well. And there are some translations into Turkish, often of the Mektubat of Imam Rabbani and a few other texts as well. But the translations also increase more so in the age of print. So in the print text, we have many more translations.
Thank you so much. You used the word or the description or the category name of pedagogy. So as a pedagogue, I'm very much interested, what are the contents of these kind of books? Is it just learning Arabic grammar by hadith learning, or is it also like, books about teaching methods like Ibn Sahnun or Zarnuji or something like this? Thank you. Yeah,
so these aren't works on pedagogy, but these are texts, primers are taught, or commentaries are taught and referenced within classrooms. So for instance, the hadith text will just have like a bab of what starts with kana wa akhawatuha of the hadith and so forth, and then it will continue with examples of different grammatical features and structures. And so from that, students can learn.
Yep, one last question, and then we'll move to the next speaker.
Thank you for your talk. Just very simply, I just wanted to know more about which Sufi orders were influential, and if you could say more about the trans-regional Sufi connections that you mentioned, you referred to.
Yeah, that's quite a large question. So there are many orders you can speak about. I mean, most prominently, it's the Naqshbandi order through Ahmad Sirhindi, and then his disciples through become the Khalidiyya and so forth in the early 19th century, late 18th, early 19th century. And then there's another current of Naqshbandis through Tajuddin Zakaria, which goes to the Hijaz in the 17th century. But before that, there's also a group from Gujarat. So there's the Muttaqi order, and Scott Kugel has a book about that recently, about the Ali al-Muttaqi and so forth. And there's Wajihuddin Alawi, the Shattariya order, the Ahmad al-Qushashi and so forth. They're students who go from Gujarat and have developed their own tradition in Medina, in Mecca as well. And those are the ones that come to mind right now.
Okay, then thank you again for presentation. And our next speaker is Fatime, who is a member of our institute, and she works on Shi'i sermons. Very interesting. Okay, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. I will hold my presentation in German, but the PowerPoint is in English. I hope it's fine for everyone. Ich werde heute folgendermaßen vorgehen. Erstmal über die Terminologienormung, was das ist überhaupt und wo es disziplinärmäßig angesiedelt wird, sprechen. Danach werde ich das empirische Umfeld meiner Forschung etwas beleuchten und die Ergebnisse in Bezug auf Terminologienormung herausfinden, was einen Prozess betrifft, und zwar Deskription, Präskription und danach am Ende als Ergebnis und Resultat die Normung. Und dann auch ein paar Gesichtspunkte aufheben in Bezug auf die Terminologienormung in einer bestimmten sprachlichen Konzeption. Und ich schließe den Vortrag auch mit ein paar Fazitpunkten. Über die Terminologienormung wird hauptsächlich in der Linguistik gesprochen und speziell in der Semantik. Bestimmt sind Sie damit in Berührung gekommen mit anderen Terminologien wie Terminologisierung, Terminographie, Lexikographie, so elektronische Wörterbücher, multimediale Datenbanken und so weiter. Und machen Sie wahrscheinlich für Ihre Forschung auch davon Gebrauch. Terminologienormung ist sehr wichtig für die Fachsprachen, so Sprache der Medizin, Sprache Jura, Sprache von Technikwissenschaften, Ingenieurwissenschaften und Technik, und aber auch außerhalb der Entstehung und Entwicklung deren, auch für deren Didaktik in Lehramt und in den Fachsprachendidaktik. Es ist natürlich von Fach zu Fach anders, von Disziplin zu Disziplin, aber auch von Text und Kontext abhängig, sehr stark abhängig. In meiner Forschung habe ich mich fokussiert auf die theologische Sprache bzw. Fachsprache und die islamreligiöse Sprache auf Deutsch in den schiitischen Gemeinden und islamischen Zentren in Deutschland analysiert. Das kann so auf zwei Ebenen generell die theologische Sprache oder Fachsprache diskutiert werden, und zwar zum einen auf der theoretischen Ebene, was wir eigentlich hier machen, in Klammern schreiben wir etwas auf Arabisch transkribiert und dann schreiben wir irgendeine Übersetzung. Genau darum handelt es sich, um diese Terminologisierung. Aber auch auf der praktischen Ebene, so die Anwendungsbereiche, die diese Sprache und Fachsprache zur Anwendung kommt, verschiedene Kommunikationsplattformen, verschiedene Situationen, in der diese Sprache irgendwie gesprochen wird und dadurch ausgetauscht wird. Von verschiedenen Kommunikationsplattformen, in der diese Sprache und Fachsprache gesprochen wird, habe ich mich in meiner Forschung in den schiitischen deutschsprachigen Predigten fokussiert, und zwar diese Interaktion generell zwischen den Expertenteil und Laien sozusagen kann man in drei so klassische Kategorien einteilen und einordnen. Zum einen handelt es sich entweder um eine Interaktion zwischen Experten. Ich nutze absichtlich so nur die männliche Form, weil es hauptsächlich um männliche Gelehrten, Geistliche und Theologen geht, also Ulama, die Produzierende dieser Sprache sind. Zum anderen handelt es sich um die Interaktion und Kommunikation zwischen den Experten und Laien. Die wären dann so die Glaubensgemeinschaft und die Zuhörende einer Predigt, die irgendwie Rezipierende dieser Sprache sind. Wenn wir die Terminologienormung innerhalb dieser drei Klassifikationen, dieser Kategorien betrachten, auf der ersten Ebene handelt es sich um eine Reproduktion zu einer Produktion und zu einer Übersetzung. Was heißt das? Die übersetzen die ganze Zeit so islamisch geprägte Wörter, Wortgruppen, Konzepte aus den koranischen oder Hadith-Texten. Die sind so eher ältere Texte hauptsächlich auch, aber die werden auch auf Deutsch irgendwelche Äquivalente dafür gefunden und den Redefluss beeinflusst. Bei den eher so sprachlicher Produktion in den Predigten handelt es sich wiederum innerhalb einer mündlichen Rede um die Produktion dieser Sprache, auch über die Transfer und um die Übersetzung. Und wenn wir auch die Kommunikation innerhalb der Glaubensgemeinschaft betrachten, sowohl in Präsenz als auch wenn sie sich in, sage ich mal, sozialen Medien miteinander kommunizieren und unter einem Post stellen sie sich vor, kommentieren, miteinander ins Gespräch kommen, ein Thema behandeln. Wiederum nutzen sie die Terminologien, die sie irgendwann in den Moscheen in einer Predigt gehört haben. Das wird dann reproduziert und verwendet innerhalb der Laiengemeinschaft. Um davon einen besseren Überblick zu bekommen, habe ich zwei kleine Videos gewählt. Zum einen handelt es sich um ein TikTok-Video, der hat ein schiitischer Gelehrter, deutschsprachig, vorbereitet und ins Netz gesetzt, hochgeladen. Schauen Sie sich mal fokussiert, achten Sie auf die Wörter, die er dafür benutzt.
Ich glaube, wir müssen die Dings
einmal. Schließen erstmal.
Ja, einmal schließen und dann kannst du es.
Danke schön. Ja, das war's. Und das nächste Video sind 3 Minuten von einer Predigt, schiitische deutschsprachige Predigt. Es wurde in Präsenz stattgefunden und danach online aufgenommen und ins YouTube zugänglich.
Das ist ein Prinzip von Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Al-Ghalibu bi sharrin maghlub. Imam Ali a.s. sagt, jemand, der durch Unheil bzw. durch Zulm, durch Unterdrückung quasi die Macht übernimmt, er wird früher oder später scheitern. Er wird die Macht verlieren. Das ist eine klare Ansage von Imam Ali a.s. Oder man yatlubu al-izzata bi ghayri haqqin yudhill. Jemand, der die Würde durch Unrecht erreichen will, wird Erniedrigung erlangen. Durch Unrecht kann man nichts erlangen. Vielleicht kann man etwas erlangen für eine sehr kurze Zeit, aber nicht langfristig. Und Imam al-Hussein a.s. spricht ganz am Anfang seiner Reise, seiner Bewegung von Haqq, dass er auf der Seite des Haqq ist, auf der Seite von Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Er sagte zum Statthalter von Medina, zum Wali in Medina folgendes: قَدْ عَلِمْتَ أَنَّ أَهْلُ الْبَيْتِ الْكَرَامَةِ وَمَعْدِنُ الرَّسَالَةِ وَأَعْلَامُ الْحَقِّ. Er sagte, wir sind die Ahlul Bayt, wir sind die Rechtleiter, wir sind die Quelle der Rechtleitung und wir sind auf dem wahren Weg. Du weißt das ganz genau, aber die Welt hat dich verführt. das Weltliche hat dich fehlgeleitet. Und dann sagte er, Yazid ist ein Fasiq. Der Imam stellt also klar den wahren Weg gegenüber dem Batil-Weg. Auf der einen Seite Imam al-Hussein a.s., auf der anderen Seite Yazid. Haq und Batil stehen sich gegenüber. Und dann sagt Imam al-Hussein a.s., Yazid ist jemand, der offen Sünden begeht. Er ist ein Fasiq. Er ist ein Frevler. Er ist nicht in der Lage, die Muslime anzuführen. Und dann sagte er, Mithli la yubaya Yazid. Jemand wie ich kann Yazid nicht den Treueeid geben, die Bay'a geben. Wenn ich Yazid akzeptiere, wenn ich ihm den Treueeid gebe, dann können wir uns vom Islam verabschieden. Fa'ala al-Islam is-Salam. Dann gibt es keinen Islam mehr. Das heißt, wir schulden alles dem reinen Blut und der Aufopferung von Imam al-Hussein und seinen reinen und loyalen Gefährten. Wenn wir heute den Adhan hören, wenn wir heute Moscheen haben, wenn wir heute den Islam haben, wenn wir die islamischen Lehren haben, dann ist das dank des Blutes von Aba Abdullah Hussein a.s. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Und der Imam wusste, dass er...
Wahrscheinlich der Salawat ist auch für viele von euch eine neue Salawat. Ja. Okay. Ja, in diesen Videos haben Sie verschiedene Terminologien und Terminologienormen gesehen. Zum einen im ersten Video gab es so folgende. Ich möchte auf die letzte nur ein Beispiel eingehen, und zwar Bab al-Kazimin al-Ghaiz. Dafür hat der Gelehrte die Übersetzung das Tor der Unterdrücker gewählt. Aber ist das nicht ambig, ist das nicht für die deutsche Allgemeinsprache eher so missverständlich, dass man so mit einem ersten Google sieht, dass die Unterdrückung von jedem Gefühl langfristig so krankhaft wirkt und so weiter? Das war die Übersetzung, weil er auf der Suche nach einer Terminologie, nach einer festen Normung für die etablierte Konzepte von Cosmological auf Arabisch gesucht hat. Ebenfalls die mündliche Sprachproduktion hatte auch Terminologien beinhaltet, beispielsweise ich glaube, in diesem kleinen Stück war es nicht vorhanden, aber irgendwann hat er benutzt für Yazid Lanatullah alay, und als Übersetzung hat er benutzt, möge ihm Allah seine Barmherzigkeit entziehen. Ist das nicht euphemistisch? Welche Aspekte spielen noch bei dieser Terminologienormung eine Rolle und beschäftigen Gelehrten und die Autoritäten irgendwie in diesem Kontext? Wenn wir die Terminologienormung auch theoretisch betrachten, ist es immer eine schwammige Grenze und eine Entwicklung, ein Prozess zwischen Deskription auf der einen Seite und Preskription auf der anderen Seite. Bezogen auf unseren Kontext handelt es sich um eine mehrsprachige Sprachproduktion, mehrsprachige Inhalte. Und das führt dazu, dass die Prediger und die Gelehrten eigentlich die einzigen sind, die dafür entscheiden, in welcher Hinsicht sie arabischsprachige direkt benutzen, die heutzutage mittlerweile wie Internationalismen gelten. Viele von uns haben auch in diesen 3 Tagen das Wort Hadith benutzt. Fühlt man gar nicht notwendig, das Wort in Überlieferung zu übersetzen, weil es halt wie Internationalismen gelten in verschiedenen Sprachen auch. Aber daraus entstehen Terminologien. Und interessant für diesen Kontext ist, dass diese irgendwie innerhalb der religiösen Praxis entstehen und innerhalb dieser mündlichen Sprachproduktion, dieser Preskription, dieser Normung. Aktuelle Grundsätze der islamreligiösen deutschsprachigen Terminologienormung. Ich möchte auf diejenigen eingehen, die aus meiner Sicht und in meiner Forschung am wichtigsten waren. Und zwar zum einen, wie gesagt, dieser Internationalismus. Es handelt sich vielmehr, als man fragt, eine neue Terminologisierung soll geschehen und soll entstehen. Vielmehr fragt man sich, wie sollten die Begriffe am besten übersetzt werden, und die neue Terminologie entsteht eher aus einer Übersetzungsaktivität, als dass man fragt, wie sollte diesen Sachverhalt, dieses Verhältnis, diesen Gegenstand, diese Situation, die islamisch geprägt ist, genannt werden. Ein anderer Aspekt, was auch wichtig ist, ist die Kapazität der deutschen Sprache für die Bildung von Komposita. Das sind so zusammengesetzte Wörter. Das Beispiel haben wir gesehen, Wutunterdrücker. Die deutsche Sprache hat die Kapazität, Präfixe und Suffixe sowie zwei Arme auf der linken und rechten Seite aufzunehmen und bildet ein Wort. Und das hilft sehr den Gelehrten und die Autoritäten, die neue Wörter entstehen zu lassen und die zu terminologisieren. Auf Englisch und aber auch auf Arabisch sind sie halt mehrere Wörter, und auf Deutsch gibt es die Gelegenheit, wegen dieser Kapazität der deutschen Sprache auch alle in einem Wort ausdrücken zu lassen. Was auch wichtig ist, sind die Personenkreise, die Kreise der autorisierten Gelehrten, die diese Aktivität übernehmen. Aber warum habe ich das genannt, dass die nicht linear sind? Weil es zum einen die schiitischen Gelehrten nicht gebunden sind an bestimmten Gemeinden. Sie werden überall eingeladen, sowohl in ihren eigenen Stadt als auch deutschlandweit, in Bezug auf ihre eigenen thematische Präferenzen, persönliche Präferenzen, aber auch ihre Qualifikationen. Einige sind besser qualifiziert und fachlicher qualifiziert für Rechtsthemen, andere sind für Muharram-Themen, andere eher abstrakte Themen, und jeweils werden sie dementsprechend auch eingeladen. Man kann von einer Autonomie dieser jeweiligen Gelehrten sprechen. Und dementsprechend bewerten sie auch die jeweiligen Konzepte, Wörter und Wortgruppen, die generell bestehen. Beispielsweise hatte ich die Erfahrung gemacht, dass eine Gelehrte explizit thematisiert, dass er eine der Übersetzungen schlecht findet und sein eigenen Vorschlag wäre anders. Und warum? Das hat er zum Beispiel ausgeführt, welche Übersetzung richtig oder falsch wäre, welche besser adäquat zu dem arabischen Original und welche weniger. In dieser Terminologienormung besteht keine einzige Institution, die diese irgendwie zentralisiert und vereinheitlicht. Zwar gibt es IGS, Islamische Gemeinschaft schiitischer Gemeinden in Deutschland, aber fungiert eher für die Legitimität der Gelehrten und hat mit der Sprache und mit der Normierung dieser Sprache nichts zu tun. Dementsprechend besteht auch heutzutage, soweit den aktuellen Stand betrifft, besteht kein Begriffssystem, kein einheitliches Benennungssystem, was alle sich daran halten oder halten wollen. Und ich hatte auch die Erfahrung gemacht, dass dieselbe Person im Laufe von 6 Monaten seine eigene Wortverwendungen geändert hat in Bezug auf einige arabische Original. Das heißt, dass die Vorläufigkeit ist auch eine spannende Eigenschaft dieses Prozesses und die Terminologienormung in diesem Bereich. Und als letztes, der letzte Gesichtspunkt habe ich sehr interessant und sehr wichtig gefunden, dass es nicht nur die Aufgabe und die Verantwortung der Gelehrtenkreis ist, sondern im empirischen Umfeld betrachten wir, dass die Gemeinschaft auch mitbeteiligt ist für die Normung dieser Terminologie. Ich hatte die Erfahrung gemacht, dass die Übersetzung innerhalb der mündlichen Rede plötzlich zu einer Blockade führt und die Person wendet sich an die zuhörende Gemeinschaft und aus der zuhörenden Gemeinschaft, wo sie auch deutsche MuttersprachlerInnen sind, Vorschläge machen. Und das war auch sehr interessant, weil sie würden dann irgendwann im Prozess dieser Terminologienormung eine Rolle spielen. Also zusammengefasst, interessant ist, dass diese Terminologienormung im Kontrast zu den anderen Disziplinen und anderen Texte und Kontexte anderer Fächern im Laufe der religiösen Praxis geschieht. Die Normierung eigentlich wird geboren durch einen Prozess, was durch Innovation und Arbitrarität geprägt ist. Es handelt sich hierbei eher um eine Übersetzungsaktivität als eine neue Terminologisierung. Wie gesagt, die Kapazität der deutschen Sprache für die Bildung von Komposita, für die zusammengesetzten Wörter und Wortgruppen spielt dabei eine große Rolle. Und die Personenkreise, die dafür mitbeteiligt sind und die Verantwortung dafür tragen, haben eine gewisse Autonomie und daher handelt es sich um eher eine netzwerkartige Normung und keine lineare, was vorgeschrieben wird und vertikal betrachtet werden kann. Und zuletzt, dass die Gemeinschaft auch mitbeteiligt ist in dieser Terminologienormung. Dankeschön.
Yeah, thank you, Fatime. Questions?
Maybe it's fairer for those who don't know German to ask in English, or is that inconvenient for you?
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah. So thanks very much. That was great. Greatly enjoyed also the theme and the choice of objects you were studying. I suggest, or maybe I could hide it under a question, first introductory, why would it be worthwhile comparing this now to both Sunni practice and Islamological practice? Because also in Islamic studies, there are already established translations. Would they be different, and why? And when we speak about why, I have another question which I actually find even more interesting and tempting, but it may be a bit unscholarly, but well, there is a point in it. My question would be, is there not also a hidden agenda behind that style of not translating, constantly using, especially Arabic, sometimes Persian, words, in order to make your listeners feel that they belong to a different community? So it's a construction of community. It's a construction of distinction. Well, you could say sermon, predigt, but you say khutbah, yeah? Also, you are by that creating a certain home. Yeah? This is a German-speaking world where we may be perceived or want to be perceived as different, and by that linguistic offer, I create a home by not translating so much. There is a certain tendency of, I would say, not inculturation, as many Christian theologians now say, but exculturation. Some suggestions and questions, I don't know whether it's even possible to respond, but that was really to say I was intrigued and I enjoyed listening to you.
Ja, das ist eine sehr interessante Frage. Zum einen muss ich sagen, dass es einen sehr großen Unterschied gibt zwischen verschiedenen Gelehrten. Verschiedene Gelehrten sprechen in unterschiedlichen Anteil von arabischsprachigen Gebrauch. Alle sind zwar deutsche Khutbas, aber der Anteil der arabischen Sprachgebrauch ist sehr anders. Und das kann auch sein, das kann an verschiedenen Gründen liegen, unter anderem ihre sprachliche Kompetenzen auch. Die einen, die ihre Predigten hauptsächlich auf Deutsch nutzen, müssen wirklich in Anspruch nehmen, dass viele Menschen dieses Deutsch irgendwie nicht verstehen. Aber auf der anderen Seite diejenigen, die viel Arabisch nutzen, wir müssen Taqwa haben, um dann in Jannah zu gehen. All diese Keywords werden in ihren Khutbas auf Arabisch benutzt und dementsprechend verlieren sie auch Zuhörende, die wirklich diese Schlüsselbegriffe auf Arabisch nicht verstehen. Aber ich gebe Ihnen in dem Aspekt recht, dass das Arabische irgendwie die Sprache ihrer Spiritualität, muslimischen Glaubens geworden ist und daher gibt es auch nicht die Absicht, soweit ich es gemerkt habe in meinem empirischen Umfeld, das Arabische komplett beiseite zu lassen und von Anfang an bis ganz Ende alles auf Deutsch zu nutzen. Das entspricht auch nicht der Erwartungshaltung der Zuhörenden.
Ja, vielen herzlichen Dank, das war sehr interessant. Ich stelle noch eine Beobachtung von der Seite der Zuhörenden oder der anderen Benutzenden dazu. Also ich überlege auch, inwiefern die äquivalenten deutschen Begriffe nicht stark christlich konnotiert sind oder das auch meinen. Ich denke vor allen Dingen darüber nach, wenn ich zum Beispiel sage, wenn ich jetzt sage, ich wünsche einen schönen Ramadan, sage ich wünsche einen schönen Ramadan, ich wünsche einen guten Ramadan oder ich wünsche einen gesegneten Ramadan und meint aber nicht Segen eigentlich was anderes als Baraka. So. Und oder umgekehrt, wenn ich jetzt sage, auf einer Beerdigung oder wenn es eine muslimische Beerdigung ist und auf der Beerdigung sind auch Nicht-Muslime, was wären jetzt Worte, mit denen sich, mit denen irgendwie alle sich einigermaßen angesprochen fühlen würden und auch dem Toten gerecht wird? Würde man sagen, wir machen jetzt Dua oder würde man sagen, wir sprechen ein Bittgebet und meint Dua dasselbe wie ein Bittgebet? Also ich finde, also die Frage stellt sich wie wir welche Worte benutzen, bestellt sich noch auf ganz anderen Ebenen und ich fand das sozusagen, also ich wollte dem noch die Dimension der Zuhörerinnen und Zuhörer hinzufügen, aber auch der Nicht-Muslime, die das irgendwie benutzen und deswegen, genau, diese Dimension noch und ich fand es super interessant und würde gerne wissen, was weiter dabei passiert und rauskommt. Danke.
Ja, eigentlich mit Ihrer Frage sprechen Sie genau eine der Strategien, die die Gelehrten nutzen, um aus dieser Blockade rauszukommen. Und zwar die gehen irgendwie in den altchristlichen Vokabularien, die für heutzutage für heutige deutsche Allgemeinsprache als veraltet oder zu christlich belastet gelten, zurück, um dann Äquivalente für arabischsprachige Originalbegriffe zu finden. Beispiele wären zum Beispiel, außer Ihre Beispiele, die ich absolut bestätige, sind Begriffe wie sittlos oder Tugende, alleine die Begriffe sittenlos oder sittlos, Tugende, diese Wörter findet man heutzutage in der deutschen Allgemeinsprache, zumindest nicht so, die gelten als veraltet. Aber wenn der Bedarf da ist für Wörter, wie er benutzt hat, zum Beispiel Faser, Frevela, die sind Begriffe, die vielmals auch aus der christlichen Tradition kommen und natürlich unterschiedliche Assoziationen hervorrufen, unterschiedliche Reaktionen hervorrufen.
Okay. Then thank you very much, Fatimi.